The Grand Plaza Ballroom was drowning in a suffocating sea of gold. It was the evening of our 50th wedding anniversary, our golden jubilee, and the sheer, unapologetic opulence of the room was designed to reflect a half-century of unbroken, perfect devotion. Overhead, 3 cascading crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small luxury vehicle, cast a warm, radiant glow across the sprawling expanse of imported Italian marble floors. The air was thick with the intoxicating scent of thousands of rare white orchids, arranged meticulously into towering centerpieces on 40 circular tables. A classical string quartet played softly in the corner, their notes mingling with the clinking of $200 a glass vintage champagne. 150 of the city's most elite socialites, politicians, and business magnates were gathered in their finest haute couture, all here to celebrate the enduring legacy of the formidable Evelyn and Richard Sterling. To the outside world, we were the undisputed titans of the city. We were the ultimate power couple, the gold standard of matrimonial success and old money elegance. At the center of this breathtaking circus stood my husband of 5 decades, Richard. At 74, he still possessed that infuriatingly charismatic silver fox charm that had captivated me when I was just 22. He wore a flawless, custom-tailored Tom Ford tuxedo that hugged his shoulders perfectly, holding court with a group of mesmerized investors. He laughed, a booming, arrogant sound that echoed off the gilded ceilings, playing the role of the devoted patriarch to absolute perfection. Beside him stood his insufferable younger sister, Margaret, her neck draped in diamonds I had paid for, wearing a smug, self-satisfied smirk as she drank my champagne. But as I stood at the edge of the grand dais, watching my husband smile, my blood was absolute, unforgiving ice. My face was a perfectly serene mask of aristocratic composure, betraying nothing. But inside my chest, a devastating inferno was quietly burning. Because just 30 minutes prior, in the hushed, private confines of the VIP bridal suite upstairs, I had uncovered a truth so profoundly grotesque it threatened to shatter the very fabric of my reality. I had simply gone upstairs to retrieve my evening clutch. Richard's platinum tablet had been left carelessly unlocked on the heavy mahogany vanity, buzzing with an urgent notification from our private wealth management firm. I wasn't a snooping wife. I had never needed to be. As the quiet, unseen architect of the Sterling Empire, the one who had inherited the massive real estate conglomerate we built our lives upon, I trusted him to handle the day-to-day logistics of our liquid assets. But the preview of the email caught my eye. It was from our senior accountant, flagged with high importance. Emergency transfer. Beatrice's Aspen estate / trust depletion. Beatrice. The name hit me like a physical blow to the sternum. Beatrice was Richard's ex-wife, a woman he was married to for a brief, turbulent 3 years before we ever met. A woman he had sworn he hadn't spoken to in 49 years, claiming she was a painful, distant memory of his reckless youth. With trembling hands, I had opened the document. I didn't just find a single wire transfer. I found an absolute massacre of my finances. For the entirety of our 50-year marriage, Richard had been quietly, systematically siphoning my wealth. There were meticulously hidden offshore accounts, shell companies, and diverted trust funds. He wasn't just sending her an allowance. He was fully funding a life of unimaginable luxury for a woman he claimed to despise. I scrolled through decades of nauseating ledgers. He had purchased her a sprawling villa in Tuscany, a multi-million-dollar penthouse in Manhattan. He had fully funded her extravagant global vacations, her designer wardrobes, and her luxury vehicles, while I had spent 50 years sacrificing my youth, my energy, and my inheritance to build a pristine empire and a flawless family legacy, playing the stoic, supportive wife to his public-facing CEO. My husband had been living a grotesque double life, using my hard-earned fortune to treat his ex-wife like a queen. I didn't scream. I didn't shatter the vanity mirror. I didn't collapse into a weeping, hysterical heap on the plush carpet. The profound, agonizing heartbreak lasted for exactly 3 minutes, and then it was entirely consumed by a cold, calculating, and ruthless fury. I downloaded the entire 80-page dossier, forwarded it directly to my personal encrypted server, and calmly reapplied my Tom Ford crimson lipstick. Now, back in the ballroom, the string quartet faded out. The room grew hushed as Richard approached the center microphone. The spotlight hit him, framing him like a saint. "Family, friends, distinguished guests," Richard began, his voice dripping with practiced, honeyed sincerity. He looked directly at me, his eyes crinkling with absolute fraudulent affection. 50 years, half a century ago, I married the most incredible woman in the world. Evelyn has been my rock, my sanctuary, the quiet, graceful foundation upon which my entire life has been built. Without her unwavering loyalty, I would be nothing. The crowd erupted into a chorus of adoring ahs. Margaret wiped a fake, dramatic tear from her eye. Richard raised his crystal flute toward me. "To my beautiful wife, here is to the life we have built, to the absolute honesty we share, and to our next chapter together." The applause was thunderous. Richard extended his hand, expecting me to step up, take the microphone, and play my role. He expected the quiet, obedient Evelyn to smile, cry tears of joy, and thank him for his love. I stepped up to the podium. I did not take his hand. I adjusted the microphone, the metallic hum of feedback echoing sharply through the cavernous ballroom. I looked out at the 150 smiling faces, and then I turned my gaze directly to my husband. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet 10 degrees. "Richard," I began, my voice incredibly soft, yet echoing with a terrifying clarity. "You have always told everyone that I am the foundation of your life." Richard beamed, puffing out his chest, completely oblivious to the venom lacing my words. "I mean every word, my love." "I know you do," I said, my lips curling into a razor-sharp, chilling smile. "Because a foundation is meant to be walked all over. A foundation is meant to bear all the weight, completely unseen, while you take all the glory." But the interesting thing about foundations, Richard, is that when you finally pull them out, the entire house collapses. The smile faltered on his lips. A ripple of nervous, confused murmurs swept through the front tables. Margaret lowered her champagne glass, her brow furrowing in irritation. "For 50 years, I have been your rock," I continued, my voice gaining strength, ringing out like a judge delivering a death sentence. "And for 50 years, you have been funneling millions of dollars of my family's wealth to fund the extravagant lifestyle of your ex-wife, Beatrice." A collective, gasping shockwave ripped through the grand ballroom. A glass shattered somewhere near the back. Richard's face instantly drained of all color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. His jaw slackened, his eyes widening in absolute, primal terror, as the perfect facade of his life cracked wide open in front of the city's elite. Evelyn, what are you doing? Are you insane? Put the microphone down!" Richard hissed, lunging forward, his charming mask instantly replaced by panicked, desperate rage. I stepped back, entirely out of his reach, holding my ground like an untouchable titan. "I am not insane, Richard. I am finally awake," I stated, staring dead into his terrified eyes. You thought you were outsmarting a naive, silent wife. You forgot that I am the sole heir and legal owner of the Sterling conglomerate. And as of 20 minutes ago, I have frozen every single shared account, revoked your access to every property, and initiated absolute corporate liquidation. The room was paralyzed in stunned, breathless silence. "Enjoy the champagne, everyone," I announced calmly, setting the microphone down on the podium with a decisive thud. "Because my husband is going to need it when he finds out he is officially homeless." I turned my back on the man I had loved for half a century. I did not shed a single tear. As I walked toward the heavy oak doors of the ballroom, I knew that by the time the sun rose tomorrow, his perfectly curated, parasitic existence would be reduced to a smoking pile of ash. Let's freeze the frame right there. Imagine the scene. A breathtaking, multi-million-dollar ballroom dripping in gold and imported orchids, plunged into an absolute, suffocating silence. Imagine the city's most elite, powerful figures completely paralyzed, their vintage champagne turning warm in their hands as they watch the untouchable patriarch of the Sterling Empire crumble into a pathetic, terrified shell of a man. Before I take you back in time, before I show you exactly how this parasite of a husband orchestrated 50 years of profound psychological and financial deception, and more importantly, before I reveal the absolute, scorched earth financial ruin I unleashed upon him and his insufferable family, I need to pause for a moment. I need to speak directly to you. I want you to scroll down right now and let me know in the comments below, where in the world are you watching this from today? We are building a global community of survivors, of empire builders, of people who refuse to be treated as stepping stones. I want to see the incredible reach of our shared strength. So drop your city, state, or comments right now. And while you are down there, I need you to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel immediately if you have ever had to deal with toxic, parasitic family members. Hit that subscribe button if you have ever poured your heart, your soul, and your hard-earned resources into building someone else up, only to realize they were quietly siphoning your energy to feed their own monstrous ego. We all know the pain of the perfect family facade. Society conditions us, especially those of us who are empathetic, hardworking, and loyal, to turn the other cheek. We are told that marriage is about sacrifice, that family requires infinite patience, and that holding on to the illusion of peace is more important than protecting our own boundaries. We are taught to be the silent foundations, bearing the crushing weight of their delusions, their secret lives, and their unearned arrogance. But what happens when the very people you swore to protect are the ones secretly plunging a knife into your back? What happens when you realize that your loyalty was never respected, but merely exploited as a limitless funding source for their betrayal? There is a profound, earth-shattering grief that comes with realizing you have been used. But let me tell you something I learned on the night of my 50th wedding anniversary. That grief has an expiration date. And when that grief finally burns away, what is left behind is a cold, diamond-hard clarity. If you are listening to my voice right now, and you are trapped in a one-sided relationship, whether it is a toxic marriage, an emotionally abusive parent, or a sibling who treats you like an ATM, I want you to pay very close attention to this story. You are not trapped. You are not powerless. You are simply asleep to the immense leverage you actually hold. They have convinced you that you need them, when the terrifying reality they are trying to hide is that they cannot survive without you. This is not just a story about a scorned wife. This is a masterclass in taking your power back. This is a story about weaponizing your boundaries, auditing your life, and completely dismantling the gilded cages that toxic people build around us. So, hit that like button, make sure you are subscribed, and settle in. Because I am about to take you behind the velvet ropes of the Sterling Empire. I am going to show you the agonizing truth behind the golden child sister who hated me, the arrogant husband who thought he had outsmarted me, and the exact, meticulous steps I took to strip them of their wealth, their status, and their pride. You are going to want to hear every single word of this to truly understand the absolute, unmitigated devastation I rained down upon Richard and his parasitic family tonight. You have to understand the gilded cage I was born into. You have to understand the 50 years of quiet, suffocating disrespect I endured to build the very stage they were currently dancing upon. My maiden name is Harrison. If you are from the East Coast, that name likely means something to you. The Harrison real estate empire was old money, the kind of wealth that doesn't just buy luxury cars, but buys politicians, judges, and entire city blocks. I grew up in a sprawling, terrifyingly silent estate in Connecticut. It was a home constructed of cold, gray stone, imported mahogany, and absolute, rigid expectations. The walls were lined with massive oil portraits of my ancestors, men with stern faces and women with perfectly styled hair who looked as though they had never laughed a day in their lives. My parents, Arthur and Eleanor Harrison, were not parents. They were curators. They were obsessed, to a pathological degree, with our family's public image, our status in the social register, and the pristine, untouchable facade of our wealth. And in their eyes, the absolute crown jewel of their collection was my older brother, Julian. Julian was the undeniable golden child. From the moment he took his first breath, he was anointed as the sole heir to the Harrison Empire. He was handsome, possessing the kind of effortless, aristocratic charm that made people instantly forgive his glaring flaws. And those flaws were catastrophic. While I spent my childhood tucked away in the dusty corners of my father's massive two-story library, quietly devouring volumes on macroeconomics, tax law, and urban development, Julian was busy destroying everything he touched. When he turned 16, my parents bought him a brand new, custom-ordered Porsche 911. He crashed it into a brick wall 3 weeks later, driving under the influence of expensive scotch. My father didn't yell. He simply wrote a massive check to the local police chief to make the DUI disappear, patted Julian on the back, and bought him an Aston Martin the following week. "Boys will be boys," my mother had cooed, stroking his hair. "He just has a spirited soul. He is a leader." I, on the other hand, was the designated ghost of the Harrison family. I was the scapegoat. I was entirely too serious, too quiet, and, worst of all in my mother's eyes, I was a woman who preferred ledger books to debutante balls. "Evelyn, honestly, you give me a migraine," my mother would sigh, sipping her gin and tonic as she watched me review the Wall Street Journal at the breakfast table. "Men do not like women who scowl at numbers. Your only responsibility to this family is to look presentable, stay out of Julian's way, and eventually marry a man with a decent surname who can sit on our board. Do try to soften your face. You look like a grim accountant." I was not permitted an opinion. I was not permitted ambition. I was expected to be a silent, decorative accessory to Julian's inevitable coronation as CEO. But the universe has a funny way of exposing frauds. When Julian was 28 and I was 22, my father suffered a massive, debilitating stroke. The keys to the Harrison Empire were immediately, blindly handed over to the golden child. And in less than 18 months, Julian's spirited soul nearly annihilated a century-old dynasty. He made wildly arrogant, completely unvetted investments into speculative offshore developments. He embezzled company funds to pay off colossal, humiliating gambling debts in Monaco. He treated the corporate accounts like his own personal piggy bank to fund a lifestyle of yachts, mistresses, and cocaine. I will never forget the night it all came crashing down. It was a torrential downpour in November. I was sitting in the library when the heavy oak doors banged open. My mother was weeping hysterically, her pearls trembling against her collarbone. Julian was pacing by the roaring fireplace, his face pale and slick with the cold sweat of a man who knew he was headed to federal prison. Our senior accountants had just delivered the news. We were heavily leveraged, defaulting on over $400 million in commercial loans, and the banks were preparing to seize everything. The Harrison legacy was hours away from public, humiliating bankruptcy. "We are ruined!" my mother wailed, collapsing onto a velvet settee. "The country club! Our friends! The shame of it! Julian, how could you?" Julian didn't apologize. He just poured himself a drink and sneered. "It wasn't my fault. The market shifted. If the board had just given me more time..." That was the moment the ghost finally spoke. I stood up from my leather reading chair, holding a thick red binder I had been secretly compiling for 6 months. I had seen the ruin coming. I had tracked every single one of Julian's disastrous moves. "The market didn't shift, Julian," I said, my voice echoing like a gunshot in the cavernous room. "You are just an arrogant fool who cannot read a basic P&L statement." My mother gasped at my audacity, but I ignored her. I walked to my father's massive mahogany desk, slammed the red binder down, and looked directly at the family lawyer who had accompanied them. "I have spent the last 72 hours auditing every shell company and back-channel debt Julian created," I stated coldly. "I have drafted a comprehensive restructuring plan. I have already secured preliminary agreements with 3 private equity firms willing to back my strategy to restructure the debt, liquidate the toxic offshore assets, and save the core commercial properties." The room was paralyzed in stunned silence. The lawyer leafed through the binder, his eyes widening behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "My God," he whispered. This is brilliant. This could actually work." "It will work," I replied fiercely. "But I have one non-negotiable condition." I turned my gaze to my mother and my pathetic, trembling brother. "Julian is out. He steps down immediately, surrenders all of his shares, and is permanently barred from the premises. I will take over as sole owner and CEO of the Harrison conglomerate." My mother looked at me as if I had just grown a second head. "Evelyn, you? A 22-year-old girl running the company? The board will never allow it. The banks will laugh you out of the boardroom. It's the 1970s, for God's sake. Women do not run real estate empires." "Then the empire burns tomorrow," I said, crossing my arms, my face an absolute mask of stone. "And you can enjoy your new life in a 2-bedroom apartment." They had no choice. They signed the papers that night. I became the sole legal owner of everything. But the misogyny of that era was real, and my parents' obsession with appearances had not vanished. They struck a desperate compromise to save the optics. They told me I could run the company from the shadows, but we needed a public face, a male figurehead to appease the conservative board members and the ruthless bankers. Enter Richard Sterling. Richard was the son of an old money family that had secretly gone entirely broke. He had the right pedigree, the right Ivy League accent, the perfectly tailored suits, and a devastatingly charming smile. But behind his handsome face, his head was completely empty. He was a spectacular actor looking for a wealthy patron. My parents essentially arranged the marriage. It was a business transaction. Richard would marry me, take on the title of CEO, and play the role of the visionary leader in public. In exchange, he got unlimited access to the Harrison wealth, a sprawling mansion, and a life of total luxury. And I got to sit in a windowless office in the basement of our corporate headquarters, working 80-hour weeks, single-handedly pulling my family's empire back from the brink of annihilation, while Richard took all the credit. For 50 years, that was our dynamic. I was the invisible workhorse. He was the glorious show pony. And as the decades rolled on, the disrespect only amplified. Richard actually began to believe his own PR. He started believing he was a genius businessman, completely ignoring the fact that I was the one feeding him every single talking point through an earpiece during shareholder meetings. Worse still, he brought his insufferable sister Margaret into the fold. Margaret was a petty, vicious woman who had always resented me for being plain and stuffy. Because Richard acted like the king of the castle, Margaret treated me like an employee in my own home. I remember a Christmas Eve dinner 10 years ago. I had just closed a grueling $2 billion acquisition that kept the company thriving. I came home, exhausted, my head pounding, wearing a simple gray pantsuit. I walked into my own formal dining room, which I had paid for, to find Richard, Margaret, and my brother Julian, whom Richard had secretly put on a consulting payroll against my wishes, drinking my $5,000 bottles of wine. Margaret looked me up and down, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. "Evelyn, darling, still wearing those dreadful suits, I see. Richard, how do you manage? You're such a vibrant, dynamic man. You really should have married someone with a bit more life. Someone who doesn't constantly smell like a fax machine." Julian snickered into his wine glass. I looked at Richard, waiting for my husband of 40 years to defend me, to tell them that the only reason they were sitting in heated luxury, eating beluga caviar, was because I had spent the last 2 weeks surviving on black coffee and 3 hours of sleep to finalize an acquisition that funded their pathetic, useless lives. Richard just chuckled, swirled his wine, and said, Now, Margaret, be kind. Evelyn is very good at balancing the checkbooks. We need someone to do the boring work, don't we?" The rage that sparked in my chest that night was profound. But I swallowed it. I swallowed it because society tells women like me that keeping the peace is paramount. I swallowed it because I had poured my entire life into building the sterling name, and I refused to let a public divorce destroy the share prices. I justified their abuse by telling myself I was the one holding the actual legal power, even if they were too stupid to realize it. But I was wrong. They didn't just disrespect me. They viewed me as a completely limitless, emotionless resource to be exploited without consequence. I had accepted the insults. I had accepted the grueling workload. I had accepted being the invisible foundation so they could dance in the light. But finding out that Richard, the man who mocked me for being boring, was secretly funneling millions of my hard-earned dollars into the manicured hands of his ex-wife Beatrice, finding out he was buying her penthouses and funding her glamorous, vibrant life using the blood, sweat, and tears of my 80-hour work weeks, that wasn't just disrespect. That was an execution of my soul. As I stood in that grand ballroom on the night of our 50th anniversary, watching his face drain of blood, the ghost of the quiet, obedient Evelyn Harrison finally died. I wasn't just going to fire him. I wasn't just going to divorce him. I was going to utterly, mercilessly erase him from the face of the earth. The echo of the microphone hitting the mahogany podium sounded like a judge's gavel striking wood in an absolutely silent, cavernous courtroom. For what felt like an eternity, the Grand Plaza Ballroom was suspended in a state of breathless, suffocating paralysis. 150 of the city's most powerful elite, Billionaire investors, federal judges, and media moguls were frozen in place like perfectly dressed statues. The string quartet had abruptly stopped playing, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in the air, broken only by the soft, frantic whispers that began to spread through the room like a crackling wildfire. I did not wait for Richard to recover from the shock. I turned my back on the grand dais, my posture completely rigid, my chin held high, and began my slow, deliberate descent down the velvet-lined stairs. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my custom Christian Louboutin heels against the imported marble floor echoed through the room. A steady, terrifying metronome counting down the final seconds of my husband's fraudulent reign.
Evelyn! Evelyn, stop right there!
Richard's voice finally broke through the silence. It was not the smooth baritone hum of the confident CEO that the public had worshipped for decades. It was a high-pitched, desperate screech. It was the sound of a cornered, panicked animal that had just realized the trap had snapped shut. I did not stop. I continued walking down the center aisle, the sea of terrified, bewildered guests parting before me as if I were royalty. Suddenly, heavy footsteps hammered against the marble behind me. Richard lunged forward, his face slick with a cold, greasy sweat, the pristine tailoring of his Tom Ford tuxedo suddenly looking ruffled and pathetic. He reached out and forcefully grabbed my upper arm, attempting to spin me around to face him. It was a fatal miscalculation. I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I simply stopped walking, slowly rotated my head, and lowered my gaze to the manicured hand gripping my silk sleeve. My eyes were entirely devoid of warmth, emotion, or mercy. They were the cold, dead eyes of a corporate executioner. "Remove your hand from my person," I commanded. My voice was no louder than a whisper, but it carried a sub-zero frequency that made the nearby guests physically recoil. "Or I will have the security detail I am currently paying for break your fingers in front of the mayor." Richard snatched his hand back, as if my silk sleeve had suddenly caught fire. He took a stumbling step backward, his chest heaving, his silver hair falling haphazardly across his forehead. The charming facade was completely gone, replaced by a grotesque mask of arrogant indignation and raw terror. You cannot do this," he hissed, his eyes darting frantically toward the front tables where our largest shareholders were seated, watching the spectacle with wide, horrified eyes. "You are having a hysterical episode, Evelyn. You are humiliating yourself. You can't just freeze my accounts. I am the CEO of the Sterling conglomerate. I am the face of this family. You are my wife, and you will step back up to that podium and tell these people that this is a misunderstanding." Before I could even part my lips to dismantle him, two more figures stepped into my path, blocking my exit to the heavy oak doors. It was Margaret, flanked by my pathetic, aging brother Julian. Margaret's face was twisted into an ugly, condescending sneer. She was clutching her champagne flute so tightly her knuckles were white. "Evelyn, honestly, this is completely unhinged," she snapped, stepping forward with the unearned confidence of a woman who had never worked a day in her miserable life. "Have you lost your mind? Making up these ridiculous lies about Beatrice? You are ruining Richard's night. You have always been prone to these petty, jealous outbursts. It's embarrassing. Apologize to my brother immediately and go wait in the car." Julian, smelling faintly of cheap scotch and expensive cologne, puffed out his chest, attempting to channel the ghost of my father's authority. "Listen to her, Evie. You're making a scene. You don't have the authority to freeze anything. Richard runs the books. I'm a senior consultant on the board, and I say you're completely out of line. You're just a bored housewife trying to play corporate raider. Stand down before I have you medically evaluated." I looked at the three of them. Richard, the parasitic fraud. Margaret, the vicious leech. Julian, the ousted failure. For 50 years, these three had built their lives, their identities, and their immense egos entirely upon my invisible, agonizing labor. They truly believed that because I had remained silent, I was weak. They truly believed that because I had allowed them to wear the crowns I paid for, they were actually the monarchs. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of joy. It was the smile of a predator that had finally locked the gates of the enclosure. A bored housewife, I repeated, the words rolling off my tongue like poison. I reached into my diamond-encrusted evening clutch and slowly pulled out my sleek black smartphone. Julian, you have not been a senior consultant since the Nixon administration. You are a highly paid mascot whose only contribution to my company is a monthly expense report for golf balls and single malt scotch. Julian's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. How dare you? And Margaret, I interrupted, my voice slicing through his pathetic defense like a surgical scalpel. I stepped closer to my sister-in-law, my eyes locking onto the massive, glittering diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. That is a stunning piece you are wearing. A vintage Cartier collar, if I am not mistaken. Appraised at roughly $450,000. Margaret's hand flew to her throat defensively, her eyes narrowing. It was a gift from Richard for my 60th birthday. Not that it is any of your business, you bitter woman. It is entirely my business, I replied, my tone perfectly even. Because Richard purchased that necklace using a corporate expense account registered to the Harrison Trust, an account that, according to the bylaws I drafted 40 years ago, requires my dual signature for any luxury expenditure over $10,000. Which means, Margaret, that necklace does not belong to you. It belongs to the corporate vault. And I will be filing a police report for grand larceny by midnight if you do not unbuckle it and hand it to me right now. Margaret gasped, her jaw dropping open in absolute, breathless shock. You can't be serious! Richard, tell her she's insane! But Richard wasn't looking at Margaret. He was staring in absolute horror at my smartphone. Evelyn, Richard stammered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. What have you done? I did what I have always done, Richard. I managed the portfolio, I said, raising my phone. With a single, deliberate tap of my thumb, I bypassed the ballroom's standard audio-visual feed. I had not just spent the last 2 hours sitting in the VIP suite crying over the 80-page dossier of his betrayals. I had been mobilizing the most ruthless, aggressive, legal and financial team on the Eastern Seaboard. I had called my lead corporate attorney, my chief financial officer, and my private cybersecurity head, and I had given them the green light on a contingency plan I had quietly drafted a decade ago. Instantly, the 3 massive floor-to-ceiling projection screens behind the grand dais, screens that had previously been displaying a looping romantic slideshow of our 50-year marriage, flickered and went pitch black. The crowd gasped as the screens suddenly blazed back to life, illuminated with stark, high-definition white light. But they were no longer showing pictures of our wedding day. They were displaying the cold, hard, undisputed financial architecture of the sterling conglomerate. On the left screen, a massive, unredacted spreadsheet materialized. It listed every single wire transfer, offshore deposit, and luxury real estate purchase Richard had made for Beatrice over the last 30 years. The numbers were staggering. Millions upon millions of dollars systematically drained from our joint holding accounts, complete with IP addresses, dates, and his digital authorization signatures. A collective, horrified murmur erupted from the tables. I saw Arthur Vance, our lead private equity investor, pull out his reading glasses, his face turning a furious shade of purple as he read the numbers. On the center screen, a heavily notarized legal document appeared. It was titled, Restructuring and Termination of Employment. "Let me clarify a few things for the audience," I announced, projecting my voice so that every single titan of industry in the room could hear the absolute truth. I turned to face the crowd, gesturing gracefully toward the massive screens. For 50 years, my husband has stood on stages exactly like this one, claiming to be a self-made visionary. He has taken the credit for every acquisition, every merger, and every real estate triumph this family has ever achieved. I turned slowly back to Richard, my eyes boring holes into his terrified soul. "But the truth, Richard, is that you are nothing but a highly compensated employee. You have never owned a single voting share of the Harrison Empire. When my father suffered his stroke 50 years ago, I legally secured 100% ownership of the conglomerate. I placed you in the CEO chair because the board was entirely comprised of old, conservative men who preferred dealing with a mediocre man over a brilliant woman." Richard was shaking his head rapidly, tears of panic welling in his eyes. "No, no, Evelyn, please. The optics. The press is here. Please, we can talk about this in private. I'll cut Beatrice off. I swear to God, I'll never speak to her again. Just turn the screens off." "The time for private conversations expired the moment you used my money to buy your ex-wife a villa in Tuscany," I replied, my voice completely devoid of pity. "If you look at the center screen, Richard, you will see the document I executed electronically 30 minutes ago. You are officially terminated from your position as CEO, effective immediately, citing gross financial misconduct, embezzlement of corporate funds, and breach of fiduciary duty."
You can't fire me!
Richard screamed, spittle flying from his lips, completely abandoning any remaining shred of dignity. "I built this company! These investors trust me! They will walk if you remove me. They will tank the stock." I looked past him, directly at Arthur Vance, the lead investor. Arthur was already out of his chair. He looked at Richard with a mixture of absolute disgust and profound pity. Arthur didn't say a word. He simply raised his glass to me, gave a sharp, respectful nod, and turned his back on my husband. The rest of the room followed suit. One by one, the politicians, the bankers, and the socialites looked away from Richard. The illusion was completely shattered. The emperor was not just naked. He was a convicted fraud. "They don't trust you, Richard," I said softly, delivering the final, fatal blow. "They trust the balance sheets. And I have been the one writing them for half a century." I turned my attention to Julian, who was currently hyperventilating, clutching his chest as he stared at the third screen, which had just lit up with his own termination papers. "Julian," I said, my voice dripping with icy contempt. "Your consulting contract is voided. Your corporate credit cards have been deactivated. And the luxury penthouse you currently occupy in Manhattan? It is owned by a subsidiary LLC that I control. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises before I have the building superintendent leave your ridiculous golf clubs on the sidewalk." Julian let out a pathetic, whimpering sound, his legs completely giving out. He collapsed into a nearby velvet chair, burying his face in his hands, as the reality of his impending poverty crashed down upon him. Margaret was trembling violently, her face pale and heavily slicked with sweat. She frantically reached up, her manicured fingers struggling to unhook the clasp of the Cartier diamond necklace. She practically ripped it from her own throat, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it on the marble. She held it out to me, her eyes wide, with a terrified, subservient obedience she had never once shown me in 40 years. "Here," she choked out, her voice barely a squeak. "Take it. Just, please, Evelyn. I don't have any savings. The trust fund. You wouldn't. I reached out and plucked the heavy diamond collar from her trembling hand, dropping it carelessly into my evening clutch as if it were a cheap piece of plastic. The trust fund was contingent upon my goodwill, I whispered, leaning in slightly so only she could hear me. And my goodwill is bankrupt, Margaret. You should probably start looking for a part-time job. I hear the local country club is hiring coat check girls. I stepped back, surveying the absolute wreckage I had just orchestrated. In less than 10 minutes, I had completely dismantled a 50-year facade. I had stripped my parasitic husband of his title, his access, and his dignity. I had rendered my vicious sister-in-law utterly penniless. And I had evicted my useless brother from his unearned life of luxury. They were left standing in the middle of a gilded ballroom, surrounded by millions of dollars of imported orchids and vintage champagne, completely, spectacularly ruined. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I did not feel a shred of sorrow. For the first time in 50 years, as I looked at the terrified, broken shells of the family that had tried to drain me dry, I felt an overwhelming, intoxicating rush of absolute power. The ghost of Evelyn Harrison was dead. The Titan had finally arrived. And Richard, I said, turning back to my husband one final time. He was on his knees, his perfectly tailored tuxedo brushing against the cold marble, weeping openly into his hands. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and pleading. Evelyn, please, what am I supposed to do? I smiled down at him, my expression a flawless portrait of aristocratic indifference. I strongly suggest you call Beatrice, I said calmly. I hear Tuscany is lovely this time of year. Assuming, of course, she still wants you when she realizes you are entirely broke. I turned on my heel, the sharp click of my Louboutins resuming their steady, triumphant rhythm, and I began the final walk toward the heavy oak doors. I hadn't even reached the heavy oak doors of the ballroom when the symphony of destruction truly began. It wasn't loud or chaotic. It was the cold, surgical precision of a pre-planned financial execution. Suddenly, the frantic chiming of high-end smartphones began to ripple through the room like a digital plague. Richard, still collapsed on his knees in the center of the floor, felt his phone vibrate violently in his tuxedo pocket. He pulled it out with trembling fingers, his eyes red and wild. I watched from the perimeter as he stared at the screen. It was an automated alert from our private security firm. Access revoked. Sterling Estate. All biometric entrance codes terminated. He let out a choked, desperate sob. Evelyn! You can't lock me out of the house! My clothes, my papers, I have nowhere to go! You have a villa in Tuscany, Richard, I called out, my voice smooth and merciless. Though I'd check the locks on that too. I've already filed for an emergency injunction to seize all international assets purchased with diverted corporate funds. At that exact moment, Margaret let out a blood-curdling shriek from the front table. She was staring at her own phone, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. My accounts! She screamed, looking around the room as if someone would save her. The Sterling Family Trust! It says balance 0! My credit cards were just declined for my daughter's tuition. Evelyn, you monster! That's my daughter's future! No, Margaret, I countered, pausing at the exit. That was my money. Your daughter's future is now the responsibility of her mother. I suggest you update your resume. The lifestyle of a professional socialite has a very poor severance package. The most delicious part of the vengeance, however, was happening outside. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the ballroom, which overlooked the Grand Plaza's private circular driveway, The flashing amber lights of 3 heavy-duty flatbed tow trucks appeared. The guests rushed to the glass, their faces pressed against the panes like children at a candy shop. Below, the tow truck operators were efficiently hooking up Richard's limited edition Bentley and Margaret's custom-painted Mercedes SUV, both of which were legally registered to the Harrison conglomerate.
Is that my car? Richard yelled, scrambling to his feet and sprinting toward the window. Stop! You can't take that! That car is a gift!
Actually, I noted, watching as the Bentley was hoisted into the air, its high security alarm wailing a pathetic mechanical cry for help. It's a corporate asset. And since your employment has been terminated for cause, the company is reclaiming its property. I believe there's a bus stop 3 blocks east. It builds character, Richard. You used to tell me that all the time. Julian was sitting in a daze, watching his world vanish in real time. His phone was buzzing incessantly, likely his bookie or his mistress, both of whom would soon realize the well had run dry. He looked up at me, his eyes hollow. You're going to destroy the family name, Evelyn. The scandal, the press. It'll be in the papers tomorrow. The Harrison name was built on grit and intelligence, I replied, my hand finally resting on the heavy brass handle of the exit door. The Sterling name was built on a lie. I'm not destroying the legacy, Julian. I'm performing a long overdue amputation. As the security team I had hired moved in to escort the former CEO and his family from the premises, the ballroom turned into a graveyard of their former lives. They were being led out past the people they had spent decades looking down upon. The whispers were no longer quiet. They were roars of mockery. The golden child brother, the charismatic husband, and the socialite sister-in-law were being marched out of the party of the century with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the heavy weight of their own greed. I didn't stay to watch them reach the sidewalk. I had seen enough of their faces to last me several lifetimes. I pushed open the doors and stepped out into the cool evening air, leaving the wreckage of their transition from elite to irrelevant behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The sound of Richard's frantic, high-pitched pleading and Margaret's hysterical sobbing was the only soundtrack I needed, and it was fading into a sweet, distant hum as I neared the exit. The heavy, brass-fitted oak doors of the ballroom swung open before I even reached them, held by 2 stone-faced security guards I had personally vetted. As I stepped through the threshold, the oppressive, artificial heat of the Golden Jubilee was replaced by the crisp, biting clarity of the night air. It was a cold that didn't chill me. It felt like a baptism. I descended the grand stone steps of the plaza, my long silk gown trailing behind me like the cape of a conquering general. At the base of the stairs, the chaos I had orchestrated was in full bloom. The 3 flatbed tow trucks were already pulling away, the silver hood of Richard's Bentley glinting under the streetlights as it was hauled off into the night. A sleek, midnight black Maybach sat idling at the curb, its engine a low, predatory growl. My driver, Marcus, stepped out immediately, his gloved hand opening the heavy door for me. He didn't ask how the night went. He had seen the spreadsheets. He knew the Titan had finally come home. "To the penthouse, madame?" he asked, softly. "No, Marcus," I said, pausing for a moment to breathe in the scent of rain and wet pavement. "Drive through the park. I want to see the city I built." I slid into the back seat, the door closing with a heavy, satisfying thud that sealed out the world. The interior of the car was a sanctuary of dark leather and silence. As we pulled away from the curb, I looked out the tinted window. I saw Richard being led out of the hotel by 2 security guards. He looked small. He looked old. He looked like exactly what he was. A man who had traded his soul for a lifestyle he didn't earn, only to realize too late that the bill was due. We glided through the streets of Manhattan, passing the towering glass and steel monoliths of the Sterling, now Harrison, corporate headquarters. For 50 years, I had viewed these buildings as my burden. Tonight, they looked like my trophies. I leaned my head back against the headrest and closed my eyes. The weight that had been sitting on my chest since I was 22 years old, the weight of Julian's failures, my parents' disappointment, and Richard's endless parasitic demands, was simply gone. I wasn't the boring wife. I wasn't the silent foundation. I was Evelyn Harrison. I was 72 years old, and my life was finally, legally, and gloriously my own. As the car swept toward my private penthouse, the one Richard never had the keys to, I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost intoxicating. The golden jubilee was over. The real reign was just beginning. The penthouse was silent, save for the rhythmic, muffled ticking of a vintage grandfather clock in the foyer and the distant, melodic hum of the city 70 stories below. I stood on the wraparound terrace, my hands gripping the cold, polished steel of the railing. The wind up here was fierce, whipping my silver hair around my face and tugging at the silk of my gown. But I didn't step back inside. I needed the cold. I needed to feel the raw, unvarnished reality of the world after 50 years of living inside a meticulously curated lie. Below me, the city was a sprawling tapestry of amber and white lights, a circuit board of human ambition. I looked at the skyline and didn't just see buildings. I saw my life's work. Every skyscraper that bore a Harrison or Sterling name was a testament to the nights I spent awake while Richard slept, the weekends I spent in boardrooms while Margaret shopped, and the decades I spent fixing Julian's catastrophic mistakes. For 50 years, I was told that my value was proportional to my silence. I was told that a good woman is the glue that holds a family together, even when that family is made of jagged glass that cuts her every time she tries to pull them close. But tonight, that myth died. There is a specific kind of poison that exists in toxic families. It's the poison of unearned entitlement. It's the belief that because someone shares your DNA, they are entitled to your labor, your peace, and your portfolio. They treat your success like a communal well they can dip into whenever they please, but when you are thirsty, they offer you nothing but salt. They call it loyalty. They call it family values. But let's call it what it actually is: financial and emotional parasitism. If you are watching this, and you are currently playing the role of the reliable one, the one everyone calls when the rent is due, the one who cleans up the messes, the one who stays quiet to keep the peace, I want you to look at my life and see your future if you do not draw a line in the sand. Blood does not equal a blank check. Being family is not a license to be a predator. Shared history is not a justification for current abuse. For too long, we have been conditioned to believe that family is everything, a sentiment often used as a weapon by the very people who contribute nothing. They use your empathy as a handle to turn you whichever way they want. They use your success as a cushion for their own laziness. I spent half a century being a foundation. And do you know what happens to foundations? They are buried. They are walked on. They are never seen, and they are only noticed when they start to crack. I want you to realize something today. You are not a foundation. You are the architect. You have the right to audit your life. You have the right to look at your relationships, whether they are marriages, siblings, or parents, and ask yourself, is this an asset or is this a liability? If the people in your life are constantly draining your accounts, your energy, and your self-worth while offering nothing but criticism and betrayal in return, You are not being loyal by staying. You are being an accomplice to your own destruction. Walking away from a toxic family isn't an act of cruelty. It's an act of absolute self-preservation. It is the ultimate declaration that your life has value beyond what you can provide for others. Richard thought I was a resource. Margaret thought I was an ATM. Julian thought I was a safety net. None of them ever bothered to see me as a human being. And that was their fatal error. Because when you treat a powerful person like a tool, eventually, that tool is going to turn in your hand and cut you. I'm 72 years old, and for the first time, I am breathing air that doesn't taste like someone else's expectations. I have liquidated the liabilities. I have secured the perimeter. And as I look out over this city, I realize that the most beautiful thing I have ever built isn't a skyscraper or a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. The most beautiful thing I have ever built is my own freedom. Final call to action. Now, I want to hear from you. This community is a sanctuary for those who have dared to stand up and say no more. I want you to go down to the comments right now and share your story. Have you ever had to cut off a toxic family member? Have you ever had to stop funding someone else's chaos to save your own future? How did it feel the moment you finally walked away? Your words might be the exact spark someone else needs to finally break their own chains. We are building a community of independent, self-made, and unbreakable individuals, and your voice is a vital part of that. If this story resonated with you, if you felt that same fire of justice in your chest when the screens lit up in that ballroom, then hit the like button right now. It tells the algorithm that stories of resilience and self-worth matter. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. We are documenting the triumphs of the scapegoats, the rise of the underdogs, and the ultimate fall of the arrogant. Don't miss the next chapter of justice. Remember, your peace is non-negotiable. Your boundaries are your power. And you never, ever owe an apology for protecting the life you worked so hard to build. I'm Evelyn Harrison. Thank you for walking this path with me tonight. Know your worth. Then add tax. I'll see you in the next one.